Hello, and welcome to the EUROPAST podcast. This podcast is part of the international project EUROPAST, funded from the Horizon Europe Wideera program. EUROPAST tackles contemporary issues in memory studies, memory politics, political discourse, and most importantly, public history, a field of study and practice that explores the ways in which the production of knowledge about history can be rendered more democratic, open, collaborative, and empowering, as well as the challenges associated with this process. In this podcast, members of the project team talk to public history practitioners, researchers, historians, activists, filmmakers, and many others about the developments, challenges, and implications of this fascinating approach of dealing with the past. If you would like to know more about the project, follow EUROPAST on Facebook and Twitter. We hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Welcome to the EUROPAST podcast. My name is Violeta Davoliūtė and I'm the leader of the EUROPAST project. Today we have a very special guest with us, Rita Gabis, known in Lithuania as Rita Gabis, author of Guest at the Shooters Banquet, My Grandfather's SS Past, My Jewish Family and the Search for the Truth, published in 2015. This is an important book which explores the biography of two people, her grandfather and grandmother, a Lithuanian woman deported to Stalin's Gulag in 1941, and a man who collaborated with the German occupation in the town of Švenčionys. It's a remarkable family biography that is also a history of a country dealing with the challenging legacy of two occupational regimes, Nazi Germany and the USSR. Published 10 years ago, this book set a trend that would be followed by at least three other North American authors, Julija Šukys, Silvia Foti, and recently Linda Kinstler. Each of these authors are women, and all of them explore the complicity of their grandfathers in the Holocaust in the Baltics. Interestingly, each of these books raise the connection between personal biography and national history. So welcome, Rita.
Thank you very much, Violeta. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
It's nice to have you here. You may not consider yourself to be a public historian, but the fact is that more people learn from books like yours than from the work of professional historians. So tell us about yourself and how did you decide to delve into the difficult past of your family in Lithuania?
Well, first I'll just start by saying I was really surprised when the book came out, and in a lot of the reviews I got, I was referred to as a historian, which surprised me because that's not how I would consider myself. But I did research the material in my book very heavily, so perhaps that's why that title was assigned to me, as well as being a memoirist or nonfiction writer. This project began really out of, I would say, two things. Half my family, the paternal side of my family, my father's side of my family is Jewish, and then my mother's side of my family is Lithuanian Catholic. So I have this interesting, complicated mix of a heritage to begin with. I found out in a conversation with my mother, speaking with her about my Lithuanian Catholic grandfather, who had always been presented to the family as a heroic figure, who, as the Russians were coming back into Lithuania and the Germans were being routed, that was at the end of the war, and he got the children out and his sister out, literally, as bombs were falling and bridges were being mined. And so he was the great hero of our family. And along with that, there was a story of victimization in that his wife, my Lithuanian grandmother, had been arrested before the Germans came in by the KGB. They had actually been looking for my grandfather and had been sentenced to hard labor in the Gulag. So that was another part of the story. There was the hero and there was the victim. Yet, I was never really told what, aside from saving the family, what else my grandfather did during the war. And I sat down with my mother in a cafe in New York City one day, and I said, so what did Sinalis really do during the war? And she said, well, he was a policeman.
Why did you become interested in your grandfather?
I wanted to know what I didn't know. I mean, there were just holes in my family history, and there were also personal, private events in my family that I didn't understand, predilections towards violence, et cetera, that are not really things that I am that interested in as a writer, as a scholar, as a researcher. But just to say that that's part of what compelled me to want to know more. What was his background? What went through the family line, so to speak? What was his father, my grandfather's father, like? And so my mother said to me in this cafe, well, he was a policeman. And she paused, and I paused, and I said, oh, do you mean under the Gestapo? And she said, yes, quite reluctantly, I should add. And, you know, because I strongly identify with the Jewish side of my family and always have, the world started spinning around. And just from my own curiosity and my own feeling of necessity, I began to research my grandfather. And I did not expect to find anything in my first archival research efforts. And lo and behold, there was a lot of material about him that I was shocked to see and that compelled me to keep going.
But you also remember your grandfather, right? You write about him tenderly in your book.
I loved him, and I was not yet old enough to see the different sides of him, because he was a man with a volatile temper. He was a man who was a virulent anti-communist, and ultimately I learned and experienced firsthand a virulent anti-Semite. But as a child, he was just Sinalis, and he gave me sweet things to eat. He hugged me, and I loved him. He was my protector. We went fishing together. You know, that was my first impression of him. That began to slowly shift as I got older. And then I think he passed away. I was probably in my very early teens when he passed away. But I've always had a very clear memory of him.
Your book is not only, as you said, about your grandfather, but also about your grandmother, who was the victim of Stalinist deportations in 1941.
Yes.
So your family uniquely connects these two traumatic experiences, the deportations of 1941 that were brutal, and also the Holocaust that soon followed. So, first of all, how do you remember your grandmother, who came back after the deportation and kind of miraculously arrived in the U.S.? And also, you know, these experiences are often pitted against each other. How did you negotiate this dissonant heritage through your writing and just kind of thinking about all of this in your own identity and agency?
Well, so the story about my grandmother, she was in a hard labor camp for, I think her sentence was 15 years. When she was released from the camp finally, and all during this time, let me say that my aunt, specifically more than my mother, was petitioning constantly for her mother's freedom, and bribes were being sent. Her location was unknown to them for a long time, and then finally they found out where she was. Letters were written, and they would send bribes to the camp head, and they would do things like throw her in a Jeep and say, now you're going home or back to Lithuania. And they would drive her around in a circle and then dump her back in the camp. So that happened numerous times. But finally her sentence was up. She was back in Lithuania. I think she was in Vilnius. The family in the U.S. had no idea that she had been released. And then someone in a letter wrote to my aunt, my mother's sister, and said, oh, by the way, we saw your mother on a street corner.
Here in Vilnius?
In Vilnius,
Where was she originally from?
I think she was from, it wasn't Klaipėda, it was...
Pasvalys somewhere? Or,
yes.
From this part of Lithuania.
Yeah. So more bribes to allow her to finally immigrate, which she did. And when she came, she was really a ruined person. I mean, you know, she contracted tuberculosis while she was at the camp. She never really recovered from that. But also, And this happens, to incarcerated people in the United States as well. She had developed a prison mentality. So, for instance, my aunt prepared a feast for her, but she couldn't eat any of it. She just wanted plain bread.
When did she arrive in the U.S.?
She arrived in the U.S. in the late 70s.
What was her sentence? Do you know? She got, 15 years, but for what?
Okay,
especially if it was hard labor camp.
So my grandfather was chief of border police before the KGB came in. He was a nationalist, and he was also one of the first men admitted to the Lithuanian Military Academy. And so he was perceived as a threat. He and the children, when the Russians were coming in, fled to the countryside. My grandmother stayed behind because it was thought that if the whole family left at once, it would be very suspicious. My grandfather, the children, fled to farms, in the countryside that various cousins had. And my grandmother was hiding in the local church. And she went back one more time to the little apartment that they had to feed the chickens. And she was surrounded by the KGB. Someone in town saw her. And she was arrested and given a sentence in lieu of the whole family would have been arrested and sent away, but she was the only one, which angered the KGB to no end, that they couldn't find my grandfather.
And she had 3 small children who were left behind.
Yes.
How old were the children at the time?
So I believe my mother was 7 years old, and her sister was 5, and then their brother was 3 or 4. So young, very young.
Right. But this part of family history was known to you?
Oh, absolutely.
Deportations.
Because the whole story of privation, the whole story of, again, the victimization and how the family suffered. And my mother in particular, because obviously she was the one I would talk to the most about it, her terror at what was happening and suddenly her mother disappearing. That trauma lived on inside of her. And then the war trauma. She remembers hiding out in bunkers or hollows in fields when, different troops were marching by and bombs were falling. And
they were trying to escape, right?
Yeah, they were trying to escape. And then, when the Germans came in, my grandfather got a position working for the German secret police, I guess you could call them.
In the town of Švenčionis.
In the town of Švenčionis.
Right.
And so the tide turned to the better for them. Although my mother, interestingly enough, her memory of the trauma of her mother disappearing, of running away and hiding as the Russians were occupying Lithuania and then being driven out, was much sharper than her memory of the time in Švenčionis.
Was she an orphan at that time? Basically, if her father was busy all the time and she had someone else taking care of her, so the kids were
my father's sister took care of them, my Kriksha mama. So
they loved her?
Yes, she could be a very difficult person in her own right, but she filled in as the mother and took care of them. And I wouldn't describe her as a maternal figure particularly, but she was there for them, and thank goodness.
So it's a very traumatic story, whichever angle one looks at it, right? So your grandmother is the victim of deportations.
Right.
Your grandfather is a German collaborator, and who knows to what extent involved in different things. So how did you then negotiate this dissonant heritage through your writing? You yourself, you were born in North America. You basically had nothing to do with Europe, one can say personally, right? And yet you go back to the old country and you almost, try to disentangle these complicated biographies of your parents and grandparents. How did you do that? What did, what was the
Well, I think that,
path?
First of all, in a very direct way, my grandfather expressed his anti-Semitism to me when I was young. And I think we spoke about this the other night. He said, "Don't be like your father, Jews no good." And the older I got, the more I understood what that meant. And then when his activities in Svencionis became less and less mysterious the more research I did. And, he was directly and somewhat indirectly involved in a mass shooting and then other killings and, horrific events, and was in constant contact with the elders in the ghetto. And there are many stories there which I won't go into, but let's just say that through it all, he equated being Jewish with being communist, and he was a rabid anti-communist, so therefore he was a rabid anti-Semite too during that time.
He for some reason equated Jews.
Yes,
he
exactly.
was kind of he believed this Judeo Bolshevik myth,
exactly,
propaganda
narrative.
But
at the same time in the U.S., like my favorite family member was my Jewish grandmother. Her family had come over from Ukraine.
Was she born in Ukraine, sorry?
Yes, she was born in Ukraine.
Oh.
Her parents never learned English. In their household in Philadelphia, my great-grandfather became a very successful real estate person, would hire other people to speak English for him to go collect the rents.
He spoke Yiddish?
He spoke Yiddish. Everybody, he and his wife spoke only Yiddish their whole lives.
Where in the U.S.?
In Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia. There was a large Jewish community from Europe?
Yes.
Okay.
But anyway, I was very, very attached to my Jewish grandmother, to my Jewish father. And so I could feel like the traction, the pulling of these two different narratives, let's say. Although, fortunately, the Jewish side of my family was not directly impacted by the killings during the Holocaust. I mean, family members of theirs were, but not my immediate family circle. But certainly friends would come over to their houses with numbers on their arms, et cetera, et cetera. But how did I navigate these different narratives? I think that from the start, I began to really consider the fact that everybody's experience is unique, and that if I were to pursue an inquiry, say about my grandfather's exploits, if you want to call them that, or crimes during World War II, I would have to give a certain kind of weight as well to what happened to my Lithuanian grandmother, and look at memory and story as its own particular beast. And that is why I worked so hard with the research that I did, because the stories I was told by both people I interviewed and by family members were reliable, but only to a certain point. To start to untangle this, I had to rely on family narrative, on the narratives of witnesses in the town of Svencionis and other places, people who had survived time in the ghetto. I traveled a lot to Germany, to Israel, and so forth to interview people who had survived the Svencionis ghetto, and got this kind of whole puzzle piece that I then started to put together.
How many people did you interview? How many countries did you visit?
I think I visited about 8 countries, and I interviewed probably 30 people.
These were recorded interviews,
yes,
correct?
And I taped everything.
Wow.
At the suggestion of my friend Daniel Mendelsohn, who wrote a book that a lot of people are familiar with.
I wrote an article about it.
Oh,
too.
Did you?
Yeah.
He said to me at the very beginning of this, and again, I was doing this for myself. I wasn't planning on writing a book, but he said, you're going to interview these people and you think you'll remember their gestures, their facial expressions, and so forth, but you won't. And he was right. After the 5th or 6th interview, things start to blur. So I'm so glad that he gave me that good advice.
And that also brings me to my next question. You went to different places in Lithuania, to Kupiškis, where your grandfather's family used to live.
Yes.
To Švenčionis, to other places. Okay, so what is the relationship between memory that you talked about and place, particular locale?
So it's interesting, and I'll speak about Svencionis more than I guess any other place. Svencionis seemed to me to be caught in time. it seemed, it was very rural. Maybe it's changed now after a decade, I don't know. But the houses and many of them had been occupied by Jews, and the few who survived came back and tried to homes. And of course, Lithuanians or Poles had taken them over, so they were not allowed to. That's another story. But aside from the fact that there was absolutely no sign of the ghetto, there was no sign of the German occupation. It looked like a very rural, in a way, almost bleak, somewhat beautiful, rural countryside part of Lithuania. And I could find the streets where my grandfather lived with the kids, where his office had been. I was able to go into that building. There were a lot of tangible aspects to my visits there, but none that directly related to the German occupation in terms of the town specifically itself. And that was shocking to me. I had expected in my naivete to see, some evidence of the ghetto, for instance, like a piece of wire, some brick, something, like you see in Vilnius, or could see. You could go into what had been the large ghetto or the small ghetto and still see buildings. The library is one example of a place that still survives to one extent or another. And so it felt very neutral to me. And that was interesting too, to see how history moves on, right? I mean, things happen in a place that are, you would say, unimaginable, except one can imagine them. And some of the survivors I talked to would recall, for instance, seeing people dragged out of the ghetto around this particular corner, and there was a cement block, and they would be shot. And when I walked around that corner, there was nothing there. There was no cement block. There was no remnant of what had occurred.
Did you find the killing site?
Yes. I went to Polygon several times, and so there is this L-shaped, long, covered pit where thousands of Jews were rounded up and shot. My grandfather had some involvement in that. The Soviets, when they came back in, they covered this mound, huge mound. I think it was 4,000 or 6,000 people who were killed.
There were some Poles shot there as well,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Because Armia Krajowa killed a few Germans.
Yes.
Are there any kind of special marks, the place where the Poles were killed, or is that not?
Not that I remember, no. And I think that...
It was about 40 people, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. And in fact, a group of people who were led down the street, this is in a different killing, and taken to what was the old Jewish cemetery, which was in ruins, and were shot there under command of my grandfather and a few other people. Among those, I believe, were several Poles, too. And they weren't, singled out in any particularly special way. There was a movement to really rid not only the area, not only of Jews, but say Polish, what they called intelligentsia.
Right.
Anyone who might somehow move against the occupying forces.
Right. What memory culture do you find in Lithuania today, or all the contacts that you had in the past 10 years? What are your impressions? Is something changing? Is it more or less the same?
I think after my book came out, and I'm not saying that it's because of my book, but in the beginning, insofar as I understood through people I knew in Lithuania who contacted me, there was a lot of consternation about my book, and there was a lot of pushback. We weren't collaborators, we were victims. Look at what happened to us, and how dare you kind of focus on this imaginary notion of collaboration after we suffered so much under the Soviets. And then gradually that changed, and I remember just by chance seeing a mention of a magazine article in which one of my Lithuanian relatives was asked about my book, and he said, and I'm just quoting him here, not perfectly, something like, well, it's come out now and it's a good thing. And so I think there was a feeling at least among some people, that the truth might as well be told. It's not as scary to tell the truth as it is perhaps liberating.
There were a number of granddaughters that wrote about similar family experiences after you.
Right.
So do you consider yourself this third generation witness? You know, I asked you yesterday and you said you're not sure. Or can you relate to the notion of post-memory, you know, whereby the offsprings take upon themselves to fill in the gaps of their grandparents or even parents' biographies, and thus also kind of reflect upon their own subjectivity and connection to family history and connection to the places in another country, another continent where their parents were born and lived and so on.
Well,
and, what are your
in
thoughts
my
about
family,
that?
and I can't speak to other families, but, you know, both cultures, the Jewish and the Lithuanian, were highly emphasized. So I did not grow up in a family that quickly became kind of secular and Americanized at all. But I think that in terms of third generation, I don't believe that I carry the trauma of what occurred. I don't want to claim it, because after you've interviewed as many people as I have and done as much research, I feel like that would be trivializing to them. But what I do claim is a growing sense of responsibility. And that's when the work I was doing, the research, aside from the fact that suddenly a publisher wanted to publish a book from the research I was doing, but I began to feel responsible as someone who had this dual family story, but also as someone who had a Lithuanian background that contained both the story of the victim and the victimizer, and that Lithuanian collaboration had not been fully addressed at all, and certainly not in my family, but also was not something that was generally a topic welcomed in Lithuania for discussion, debate.
Or in the emigre community as well.
Yes, exactly.
What advice would you give for public historians, people who work with archives, museums, school curricula, on ways of making the past more tangible and accessible to the public, and especially bearing in mind this really complicated past, you know, traumatic, convoluted in many ways, and so on?
Well, I think, first of all, history, to my mind, needs to be presented as a living, fluid entity. I remember when I was young and you took a history class and you automatically, you know, there was a dusty old book and you would learn about things that happened long ago that had no relationship to you. But in fact, that's not true. You know, all that is past, and especially if you look at the political events going on today, really around the world, becomes clear that it's not so much that history repeats itself, but that there are pieces of experience that are very relevant, you know, historical experience that become very relevant to the present moment. And I think that's one way to approach the teaching of history. And I also think, too, first-person narratives are wonderful, to have people speak and either, you know, be recorded. I mean, I think ideally, wouldn't it be wonderful if a classroom could go out with video cams or just notebooks and talk to folks who have memories or who remember the memories of their parents or their grandparents. I think that's one way to make history come alive that is impactful, meaningful.
Okay, I have two last questions.
Please.
So what was the reception of your book? 10 years past, probably had different people expressing different opinions. If you would just say a few words of what were the main experiences.
My book was very well received. Strangely, I was asked after I did a lot of readings and went on a big book tour. And after almost every book tour, someone would come up and ask me, so was this a cathartic experience for you? And it always seemed like a very strange question to ask. And I think I don't even remember how I would reply, but there's nothing cathartic about it. I mean, what I was writing about, that part of history, there's no catharsis. You just hope to learn from it and continue on. So some people saw it as a kind of personal drama, and other people saw it as the work of a historian who also wrote poetry, nonfiction. So it was kind of a mix. The Jewish community embraced it. The non-Jewish community had a harder time with it. The Lithuanian embassy, it was interesting to feel the reception of my book and to hear people speak about it there after I gave my talk. Then say doing an event for, the Jewish book culture and hearing the audience ask questions after an event like that.
I did not intend to ask this question, but as I was listening to your answer, I decided to ask you, so what did you learn? Not only those biographical facts that you did not know, but, thinking about the relevance of this history to the present day. If you would have to,
So, two things I'll say briefly. One of the people I interviewed was the head of Lukishki, is that right, prison?
Lukishka's prison,
yeah,
right.
Which is, I think, is no longer a prison. I'm
no,
not sure.
It's not.
Yeah.
We can walk there. I can show you. It's an interesting hub now.
Yeah, it's changed now. But he said to me, because my grandfather briefly spent some time in there and I wanted to go in and I wanted to see it. Like, I wanted to see everything. And he was like, go away. Your grandfather wouldn't want you to come to this place. If you come in here, you'll be marked by a stain that you can't wash off. And that was very compelling to me. And it's true in a way. Like, you do this kind of research and it changes you in ways that you can't quite imagine and that you can't really ameliorate or get rid of. But the other thing I'll just say is that a phrase kept going through my head the whole time I was working on this project, and that was war unending. I just felt like the things that I was researching, there's a kind of line of continuation through time in which perhaps not the same kind of slaughter and perhaps not the Holocaust per se, but different types of genocide, different types of incursions, different types of war. In other words, it's ongoing and there is no end to it. And now look at what we're seeing in terms of Ukraine and the vulnerability of the Baltics. I'm a poet in part, so I have these phrases that stick in my head, and that was one of them.
You're in Vilnius now, and you are doing research again. So what are your current projects?
So I'm writing actually another memoir about what it is to come back after 10 years. And I'm actually in the process of applying for dual citizenship for many different reasons. And that's part of the book. So I'm working on 2 different projects. Fingers crossed.
Fantastic. We'll look forward to your future books.
Thank you, Violeta, so much. And
Thank
thank you for the
very
work
much.
you do.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us.
Of course.